Hey everybody, I'm back with another Photoshop tutorial. Today we're going to be looking at how to make a really cool double exposure photo manipulation. We're going to cover some really basic aspects of Photoshop like layer masking, using some adjustment layers to control colors and tones, and we're going to be going over some more blending modes and things of that nature. So let's just jump right in. It's going to be really quick and super easy, okay? So first of all, I try and provide you guys with the project files. So here I have a bunch of images, mostly from Unsplash. I got one image from Google Images. And as usual, here is the final project file for you guys to reference if you get a little bit lost. So to start off, what I'd like to do is in Photoshop, let's open up a new document to start from. I typically like working from the 1920 by 1080 HD TV preset. To find that, if you don't have it, you can just click on Film Video, and it's this one in the top left-hand corner. I'm going to make sure that my specs are good, so I have 1920 width by 1080 height, resolution 72. I can just come down here to color profile and choose working RGB or sRGB. And I think everything else is good there, so we can go ahead and hit create. Y'all should end up with a file that looks like this. Next up, I'd like us to go into our double exposure demo project folder, and we're going to grab this Jessica image from Unsplash. We're going to go ahead and open that in Photoshop in its own separate panel, and we're going to move it out of its original document into our composite, double exposure file that we're going to work on. So all you have to do is have the move tool selected, V on your keyboard, or just click the move tool up here and click and drag from its original file into our new sort of untitled document. And right when you drop it, the first thing I'd like us to go and do is right click on the layer itself, and we're going to convert this to a smart object. Remember, when we convert elements to smart objects, it helps them to retain their resolution so that they are really good quality, very easy to work with, and it's non-destructive, which is a big component of doing photo manipulations. So after you convert it to a smart object, I just hit Command T to enter my transform tool. And I'm just transforming it so that it fills the page up similarly to this. I want my subject matter in the center, and I'd like the subject matter to almost come to the top of the frame, but not quite. Once you have something that looks like this, we can go ahead and hit enter. Okay? Excellent. So that's step number one. Step number two is going to be isolating our subject from the background. And to do that, we could do it a couple of different ways. We could use the pen tool, and we could go in and create a really detailed mask around our subject. And that would probably take a little bit of time. It would be very accurate. But in this case, because our subject is on such a crisp, clean background, what we can do is use our magic wand tool. So W on the keyboard to bring up the magic wand, or it's just over here on your left hand side, and we can click on this wonderful select subject button. Photoshop will then analyze our image and determine what our subject is. This works very well in this case because we have a super high contrast, a super clean background, and a very obvious subject matter. I know we've checked this out before, and if you have a bit of a complicated image, this might not always work, so just kind of keep that in mind. Once we have our subject selected, if you wanted to, you could go into select and mask, and using the refine edge brush tool from over here, which we also have covered earlier, you could go in and try and just make sure that you've cleaned up as much of any spots or errors that you might have noticed from the automatic selection. I don't really notice that many problems, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave the selection kind of as it was. Okay. Next thing is we have to create a mask. So we have to mask out or temporarily remove the background from our subject. So to do that, we can come down to our layers panel, and there's a layer mask button right here in the bottom right hand corner section. We can go ahead and click on that, and you'll notice that a new layer mask has been applied to our layer. So layer masks, anything that is black means that it is no longer visible. Anything that is white means that it is visible. So in this case, our subject is visible nicely and our background has been removed. Sort of. If you ever wanted to go back and double check, all you have to do is press and hold shift and click once on the layer mask, and it will show you the background and everything just as it was originally. So this is a great non-destructive editing technique because it means that we can go back and bring back the background if we really liked it, or we can sort of go back and remodify our mask if we have to. Okay? In the spirit of being organized, I'm going to rename this layer to woman, just trying to keep it fairly on the point about what's in the layer. So we have our woman layer, and she's set up and she's placed nicely, and we're ready to move on to the next step. The next step is going to be to bring in our next image, which is this Jared Unsplash image of this girl in a yoga pose. So we can click and drag this into Photoshop and open it up in a new document, just like we did the first image. This time I'm also going to use my move tool, so V on the keyboard, or the move tool here in the top left, and I'm going to click and drag it into our untitled document. I'm going to zoom out using Command minus or Control minus on my keyboard so that I can get a better view of everything. And I'm just going to scale it down so that it's a little bit smaller than our actual subject underneath. And you can sort of align it right up to the top. Now, you might be wondering, how do I tell where my top image is in relation to the subject underneath? And that's very easy to sort of rectify. All we have to do is hold down Alt or Option on our keyboard and click on, I'm just going to undo that. So holding down Alt Option on our keyboard and clicking on our layer mask, you'll notice that you get a different type of cursor. It's a black arrow with a white arrow underneath it. If we click and drag that onto our new layer with our yoga girl and let go, it will duplicate the exact layer mask from the woman layer onto our new layer 1. So it takes a lot of the guesswork and sort of like selecting out of the equation once again. Once you have the layer mask placed or a new layer mask created on layer 1, we can go ahead and rename this layer to Yoga Girl. Yoga Girl, there we go, excellent. And she's probably not placed exactly where we want her to be. So when we're working with masks, we have to remember that when this is linked, this little chain icon is present, it means that the mask will move with the image. So if we move it, you'll see that you'll sort of adjust the entire mask itself along with the image. If we unlink the image from the mask, with our image selected, you'll see that we'll be able to move our image independently of the mask, and vice versa. If we wanted to move the mask independently of the image, we can click on the mask instead. So I'd like to move the image without moving the mask. So make sure you have the link unchecked so it's not present, and we can sort of shift our yoga girl around a little bit. She's a little bit too large. I'd like to scale her down a bit so that she fits nicely in the main section of the woman's head. I definitely like this sort of sun flare to be as centered as possible. And that looks pretty solid to me. So as you can see, I'm sort of cutting off a bit of the lip, bit of the chin, and definitely a lot of the chest. But we're going to come and fix that up in a minute. Now, I know that I preach a lot about smart objects and non-destructive editing and things like that. In this case, with this yoga girl, we are going to be making some very specific changes to her. So I can't have her be a smart object because of the changes that we're going to make. In reality, because we have the original image so close at hand, we're not doing tons of damage. We still have the original to go back to if we really need it. So we're just going to leave her as a regular layer. Okay. The next step on our double exposure journey is going to be filling in this section by the lip and this section down around the shoulder and the chest. To do that, we need to use Content Fill Aware. So we've done this a couple of times in our demos in class, and I'd like to show you, I'd like to remind you how to go about doing it, but I'd also like to show you something new and fun that also comes in handy. So for this section over here by the lips, we can definitely use Content Fill Aware and it'll work perfectly. So I just want to use my marquee tool. That's M on the keyboard, or we can go up here and grab our rectangular marquee tool. Yours might be hidden if you had the elliptical one open recently, so just click and hold down and grab the rectangle one. And we're just going to click and drag out a nice sized rectangle, slightly overlapping what's already there. And we can right click and hit fill. And under contents, just make sure to select Content Aware, and we can go ahead and hit OK. And what you'll notice is it sort of fills in that section using AI to the best of its understanding, and it looks fairly decent. The next technique that I'd like to show you guys is really similar to Fill Content Aware, but this time it's called Fill Content Scale. So using our marquee tool once again, so M on your keyboard to get the rectangular marquee tool, let's go ahead and drag out a decent sized marquee, sort of along the bottom section of our yoga girl image. Now, if we were to hit Command T or Control T to activate our transform tool, you could actually just transform this selection as it is. You could click and drag, or you could hold Shift and click and drag the bottom handle down, and you would see everything kind of, it does kind of fill, but it stretches everything and it looks really kind of gross and it gets pixelated, and that's not really very fun. There's another type of transform that we can do that is very similar, but at least avoids the pixelization of everything. So what I'm talking about is something called Content Aware Scale. To get there, you can go up to Edit and hit Content Aware Scale, or the keyboard shortcut would be Option Shift Command C, or Alt Shift Control C if you're on a PC. So we're going to go ahead and hit that, and we're going to hold Shift and we're going to drag it down, and then we're going to hold Shift and we're going to drag it out to the right a little bit, and we can go ahead and hit OK. So what this did was it actually generated pixels for us. It didn't really warp or stretch anything, even though it kind of doesn't look the greatest. It's not a big deal because we're going to go and sort of adjust it a little bit more in a moment to sort of hide all of this grainy, messy looking noise. So it's all good. But that there is just two different ways to be able to fill in missing content from within your mask. Okay, so we did Fill Content Aware and Content Aware Scale, which is kind of cool. Okay, let me just check my example here before I move on. Yep. So the next step we're going to do is to create a curves adjustment layer to really make the black, the darker tones in our yoga girl really dark, and make sure that they look nice and rich and really natural instead of the super noisiness that we're seeing right now. So to do that, you can go up to your adjustment layers, you can select curves, and it will create a curves adjustment layer in your layers panel. Okay. And what I'd like to do is click this bottom node in the bottom left corner and drag it in towards the center a decent amount. You'll start to notice that it really crushes the blacks and it really makes them look super rich and deep. Okay. And then I'd like to grab the top right handle and I'd like to drag it in towards the center. This is going to really wash out the highlights and sort of blend them really beautifully into the white background that we have. Okay. So I'm good to just leave it as is like that. The next thing we can sort of do is we want to make sure these curves are only being applied to the Yoga Girl layer. Right now, the curves are actually also hitting and adjusting the woman layer, and I want them to only focus on Yoga Girl. So to do that, we have to create what's called a clipping mask. Clipping masks are really useful because they tell an adjustment layer to only affect the layer below it. So to create a clipping mask, we can right click on the curves layer and we can come down to, I can never find this one at first glance. Create clipping mask. There it is. So you can hit create clipping mask and now it's only affecting the Yoga Girl layer. The keyboard shortcut for this is to hold down Option or Alt and hover your mouse in between the two layers. You'll see that you get this little arrow down icon. Just click once and it will apply a clipping mask in the same way, right? It's just a keyboard shortcut as opposed to going through a menu. So that's great. Next up, I'd love to see the detail of the woman's face and a little bit of her shoulders coming back through. So to do that, we need to duplicate our woman layer. We can do this two ways. We can either click and drag this layer down to the new layer icon and duplicate it that way, or you can hit Command J or Control J on your keyboard and duplicate it that way. I'm going to click and drag this layer up to the top of the stack so that she's on top, and I'm going to change the blending mode. I'm just going to kind of slowly cycle through blending modes until I find one that I think works well. So far, Lighten looks really great. Screen also looks really good. Linear Dodge, not doing too bad. I think Linear Dodge is better than lighter color. We're definitely not going to use any of these ones. They're too dark. Difference is interesting, but it's not the effect I'm going for. Okay, cool. So I think Lighten, it's either Lighten or Linear Dodge. What do I get the most detail from? I think it's going to be Linear Dodge is what we're going to go with. Okay. So basically, you know, when it comes to choosing blending modes, it's a little bit of a pick your own adventure. It's not necessarily a guessing game if you know what you're looking for. I had a feeling it was going to be one of these ones in here, but it's just a matter of sort of figuring out which one looks best for your application. Okay. So now I have the details of my woman coming back in. I can still see the inner double exposure happening with our Yoga Girl. And I think the next element we're going to focus on is going to be the background. So if we look at our example here, our background is sort of this really beautiful, warm, abstract color texture. It's kind of interesting when you're looking for textures online because you have to kind of be able to think beyond what the picture looks like. So, for example, I went to Unsplash and I found this image. And what really struck me about this image is the colors in it and the tones and the highlights. I know that I'm probably going to have to do a lot of Gaussian blurring to smooth this out to get the colors I'm looking for. And it's going to work great because it's going to look super natural. It's going to have, again, wonderful range of shadows to highlights, and the colors are really saturated and really rich. So when you guys are looking for textures, try and think more in terms of what the final effect could look like or what your final goal is. And if you think you can achieve like a softening through blurring and still getting the color tones or the texture that you're looking for, then, go for it. It's really worth exploring a lot of different elements when you're looking for textures and background elements and cool things like that. I think this one probably took me like 4 or 5 minutes to have to find, to be honest. Okay, so enough about exploring textures. Let's click and drag this directly into our image, into our composition. So first things first, we kind of have to rotate this and scale it up so that it fits our composition nicer. And like I said, we're gonna have to blur this a lot so that we remove all of these sort of bubbling details and all of this noisiness. Okay, so blur is an effect, it's a filter, and so you'll find it up here under filter, blur. There's plenty of different blurs to choose from. Gaussian blur is kind of your everyday, kind of average Joe type of blur. It's pretty useful, but the thing I find when you're working with Gaussian blur is a little bit of Gaussian blur can make things look low resolution. A lot of Gaussian blur, like 50, can really smooth things out nicely if it's a high enough resolution. So we're going to go with a blur of 50 for the purposes of this example today. Okay. And once again, this image is completely covering up all of the hard work that we just went towards building. So we're going to have to use a blending mode to be able to see through it. Now, I forget which blending mode I used in the example. So once again, we're just going to kind of go through mode by mode. It looks like it was hard light that we were using. For sure it was. And you can see the really beautiful tones coming through, the way that they're hitting our image and things like that. One of the really big key tricks to making a double exposure work is the lighting. Okay, and I'll show you what I mean. So the lighting, I'm just going to turn off a bunch of our layers. The lighting on our main subject is actually coming from over here. Right? The sun is kind of hitting her from right here. In our yoga girl, the lighting is coming from here. So unfortunately, we don't have a perfect match between our two images. Ideally, you want to find images that have the same lighting direction. It makes life a lot easier when it comes time to sort of selling the illusion of the double exposure. What we're going to do with our background sort of color texture layer is sort of fake the direction of the sun. And so to do that, you don't have to keep your layers perfectly straight or parallel to the canvas. You can scale them way beyond the bounds of the canvas. So I'm scaling this layer really, really far beyond our edges, and I'm going to turn my background texture. What I'm trying to do is line up this bright yellow patch of color with the sun that would be in that yoga girl image so that the highlight really matches where it is in that image, and it makes it a little bit more believable, and it will help us in a few minutes when we go and add in a couple of lighting effects. Okay, so we have our background color texture sort of worked in. I call it the background even though it's on top. It's just because it works in the background. We can call this BG color texture, just to keep things organized. Background color texture. Awesome. And it's not quite vibrant enough for me yet. It's close, but it's not quite there. So I'd like to take I'd like to make a second curves adjustment layer. So we can go up to adjustment, select the curves. It'll create a new curves layer. I'd like to clip mask it to the BG color texture. So for those of you guys paying attention, we were going to hold down Option or Alt and click in between the curve and the BG layer here and create our clipping mask, or you could right click and select create clipping mask from that menu. Okay. I'm going to come back over here to properties so that I can see my curves chart. And I'm just going to start making some adjustments. I want things to be brighter, so I'm going to move my top right handle in towards the center. I would like everything to brighten up a bit, but I'd like my shadows to remain, dark and really rich. So I'm going to pull my shadows that are sort of down here in this quadrant. I'm going to bring them back in towards the center line, or maybe just a little bit below it. And what we end up with is a very subtle curve, a very subtle, almost like, barely an S curve, but it's kind of there. And now I think, let me just turn this layer on and off and see what the difference is. Yeah, I really like that difference. I think it looks nice. The only thing that's kind of happening now, though, and I'm not a huge fan, is we're clearly able to see some of the bands that are happening in the gradient from our blur. And we can hide that. It's not the hardest thing to hide. It's unfortunate that it's happening, but, it's kind of what happens when you filter images really heavily. I'm going to go ahead and hit New Layer to create a new empty layer. We're going to focus on creating a noise layer to sort of hide the banding that's happening. I'd like to fill this layer with black. So what I like to do is have black set to my background color. You can see it right here. And then I like to hit Command backspace, Command delete, or Control backspace, and it fills the layer with the background color. Personally, I find that much quicker than having to go find my paint bucket, switch it to, keep it on foreground, change my foreground color, and then fill it. I just find that's way too tedious. But however you like to do things, it's up to you. Anyways, once I have my layer filled with black, we can go up to Filter, and we can go to Noise, and we can add noise. Okay, I know it seems weird to want to add noise in because noise kind of sounds like pixelization or low resolution, but noise is actually really useful at hiding kind of ugly features of things that you don't want people to necessarily notice really quickly. So, we can use like a decent amount, maybe somewhere near 15 looks good. I'm going to use a Gaussian noise, which means that I can actually use less noise. Isn't that excellent? What does 8 look like? We're going to go, we're going to go with, 9 looks good. And it's really subtle, but you can actually tell the noise is made up of different colors. There's a lot of green, there's a lot of purple, there's some red in here. I don't really want it to be colored noise. I'd rather it be monochromatic. So I'm just going to switch it to monochromatic, and that'll make it black and white. Okay. So we can go ahead and hit OK after we're happy with our noisy settings. And we can switch this from normal to screen so that it eliminates all of the black from that layer and it just keeps the white noise. Obviously 100% is a little bit too much. It looked way too noisy. We could try something like 75. And I'm going to rename this layer from layer 1 to noise. And so you can see just how good of a job that does of kind of carrying that noise texture from the Yoga Girl interior image to the background, but also sort of visually hiding some of that banding that's going on. It sort of tricks your eye into not seeing it as much. Very kind of useful, fun technique. Okay, so one thing that I'm noticing is I'd like to see a little bit more detail within our main subject's face. I'm kind of losing some of the detail over here. So what I think I have to do is I'm probably going to have to adjust the mask on our Yoga Girl layer. And I'd like to just brush away some of the mask that's happening up and around this area. So I want to select just the mask. I want to make sure that I can see that there are the 4 handles on my mask layer. And if we remember, black on a mask means that the image is being hidden, and white means that the image is visible. So because I want to hide some of my yoga girl image, I want to make sure that I have black set as my foreground color. I want to make sure that I'm using my brush tool, so B on the keyboard, or brush tool right here. I want a low opacity, something around 30% probably will do. I want a lower flow, maybe something around 30% as well. And I want to make sure the hardness is definitely set to 0. This will just allow for a really soft, delicate sort of adjustment on our mask. Once you have those settings sort of ready to go, we can start sort of brushing away ever so slightly around the very edges of our subject's face. You don't want to go too far in, because as you can see, I'm kind of very obviously able to see skin tone and things like that through it, and it sort of breaks the illusion. So I'm going to just sort of adjust my brush size until I can sort of, fix it. If you did what I did and you accidentally sort of, adjusted the actual line of things, do your best to go back in and fix it. But just work in small little patches, a little bit at a time. And obviously, if you go too far and you really can't get yourself back, we can always open up our history window here and see all the adjustments that we've made. So if you don't have that history window available, it's just right here under window history. Okay, cool. I'm happy with that adjustment. Now I can see her eye. It makes it a little bit, more connecting, more personable, things like that. The last thing that I want to add to this composite is a lens flare. Lens flares, you can find them on Google. They're very easy to find. For example, here, if I go to Google really quickly and I search for lens flare, and I go to images, there's tons of them available. Some much cheesier than others. You kind of need to know what type of effect you're going for when searching for a lens flare. And what I would always recommend is under images, go to tools and change your image size to large. This will just make sure that you're getting a high quality image to work with within your composites, and that the effect won't look pixelated when you finally apply it. Okay? That kind of goes for any image search on Google, by the way. It's not just for lens flares. So let's click and drag our lens flare into our composition. We can go ahead and hit enter to place it. And I want to make sure my lens flare is above everything but below the noise layer. Okay. We're going to have to change the blending mode, because obviously I want to eliminate the black from my lens flare. I only want to see the highlights. And to do that, we can use the screen mode, and it eliminates all of our black, which is excellent. I'm going to click and drag my lens flare up to where the sun is clearly shining through my yoga girl. And I can use Command T or Control T to enter transform and sort of scale it up a little bit and re-angle it, because I really like the effect of these rays pouring down over this girl's hair. Now, one thing that really bugs me about this is it's not the right tone. The highlight isn't, it looks pretty white, and all of our highlights in this image are more yellows and oranges. We can make an adjustment layer to fix this. And so what I'd like to do is go over to our adjustment layers panel, click on hue saturation, And we're going to have to create another clipping mask. So this time we can hold down Option or Alt on the keyboard, click in between these two layers, lens flare and hue and saturation, creates our clipping mask, or we can right click and come down to create clipping mask right here. And what I want to do is I would like to colorize our lens flare layer. Within our hue saturation adjustment panel, you have the ability to change the hue and saturation of the overall layer itself, or you have the ability to colorize it to a specific hue and saturation and lightness. So I know that I want this to be somewhere in between orange and yellow, maybe. I want it to be super saturated so that it really matches the same sort of tones we've got going on. And you really want to be careful with the lightness when you're dealing with something that's on a screen blend mode, because it's very obvious where the black ends up being, you know. So it's honestly fine if you just leave the lightness at 0. What really matters here is the color. And so, you know, just to experiment, like you can see, we can change it to purple, you can change it to blue, you can change it to green. I want to stick within the tones that we already have established. So again, orange and yellow is kind of where this lives its best life. And that's kind of, you know, how to change the hue of an element. I think that pretty much covers us for this demonstration. So once again, we learned how to apply layer masks, how to utilize the same layer mask on multiple layers to create a double exposure effect, how to subtly go in and change the layer mask to highlight extra features. We've used a lot of blending modes, which is excellent, and we've kept all of our layers beautifully organized and looking spectacular, and we have a really, really wonderful double exposure photo composition. So I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial, and I'll see you in the next one.